Betrayal tastes sharpest when served at the altar, especially when the other woman wears your sister's face. What happens when a disgraced bride is cast aside by a weak lord, only for the realm's most lethal alpha king to crash the ceremony and claim the groom's crown for himself? Rain battered against the stained glass windows of St. Jude's Cathedral, casting fractured prisms of colored light across the cold stone floor. Georgia Margaret Alcott stood at the precipice of her new life, shivering slightly beneath the heavy layers of her ivory velvet gown. The fabric was embroidered with the silver crest of her family's pack, interwoven with the howling wolf insignia of her soon-to-be husband. Beside her stood Abram William Kingsley, the future alpha of the Silver Pine territory. He was everything a high-born maiden of the medieval northern realm was taught to desire: tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of pale winter morning and a lineage as old as the mountains. Yet, as the high priest of the moon goddess raised the ceremonial groom's crown, a delicate, ancient circlet wrought from oxidized silver and intertwined with dried wolfsbane, Georgia felt a terrifying void radiating from the man beside her. Their union had been arranged for 5 years. It was a strategic alliance designed to merge the wealthy, resource-rich lands of the Alcott family with the military might of the Kingsley pack. Georgia had spent her entire adolescence preparing for this exact moment. She had learned the ancient prayers, mastered the political dances of the northern courts, and accepted her place as a dutiful Luna. She had even convinced herself that the polite, albeit distant affection Abram showed her was love. But today, the air between them was unnaturally cold. The mating bond, a sacred tether that should have been sparking to life as they stood before the altar, was non-existent. Abram Kingsley, the high priest intoned, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, carrying over the hundreds of noble wolves gathered in the pews. Do you accept this woman, Georgia Margaret Alcott, as your fated mate and sworn Luna? Will you bear her burdens, protect her throat, and share your soul until the goddess calls you home? Silence stretched. It was not the pregnant, joyous silence of a dramatic vow, but a suffocating, heavy dread. Georgia turned her head beneath her sheer veil, looking up at Abram. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles ticked in his cheek. He was not looking at the priest. He was not looking at her. His pale eyes were fixed on the front row of the congregation. Georgia followed his gaze, her heart dropping into her stomach. Standing in the front pew, wearing a gown of emerald green that brazenly defied the traditional muted colors of a wedding guest, was Beatrice Rose Alcott, Georgia's younger sister. Beatrice possessed the fiery, chaotic beauty that Georgia lacked. Where Georgia was quiet, dutiful, and possessed a subdued, dormant wolf spirit, Beatrice was fierce, uninhibited, and radiated the intoxicating pheromones of a prime female in peak form. Abram, Georgia whispered, the sound barely escaping the tightness of her throat. Abram blinked, finally looking down at her. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a heavy, burdened pity that cut deeper than any blade. I am sorry, Georgia, he murmured, his voice low but carrying the rumbling resonance of his wolf. Before she could process the apology, Abram took a step back from the altar. The collective gasp from the congregation was akin to all the oxygen being sucked from the massive cathedral. Noble lords half rose from their wooden seats, and the whispering began instantly a rising tide of scandalous murmurs. I cannot take these vows, Abram declared, his voice now projecting so the entire cathedral could hear. He raised his chin, adopting the authoritative posture of a leading alpha, though his actions were tearing the sacred traditions apart. The goddess dictates that an alpha must mate where his soul finds its true match. For years I believed this arranged union with Georgia was my duty, but a wolf cannot lie to its nature. A true mate bond cannot be forged by political treaties or ink on parchment. Georgia stood frozen, the heavy veil suddenly feeling like a burial shroud. What are you doing? She choked out, her hands trembling as she clutched her bouquet of white winter roses so tightly the thorns pierced her leather gloves. Abram did not answer her directly. Instead, he descended the 3 stone steps from the altar and walked toward the front pew. He extended his hand. Beatrice stepped forward, her emerald eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and feigned innocence. She placed her delicate hand into Abram's massive palm, stepping out into the center aisle. My soul has found its match, Abram announced, pulling Beatrice firmly against his side. The scent of them pine needles mixed with Beatrice's overwhelming aroma of crushed wild berries flooded the cathedral, solidifying the truth. They were a match. A recent, fiercely burning match. Beatrice is my fated mate. I formally reject the betrothal to Georgia Alcott. I will take her sister Beatrice as my Luna and wife. The high priest lowered the silver crown, his weathered face pale with shock. Lord Kingsley, this is a desecration. The treaties were signed by your father and hers. To reject a bride at the altar is a mark of profound dishonor. I am the Alpha of Silverpine now, Abram retorted, his voice vibrating with a warning growl. My father is dead. I make the laws of my pack, and I will not bind myself to a woman my wolf feels nothing for. Georgia's wolf is barely present. She is cold, scentless, an anomaly among our kind. She cannot lead my people. Beatrice is strong. She is my mate. Georgia swayed on her feet. The humiliation was absolute. It was not just a rejection of marriage, it was a public execution of her character, her worth as a werewolf, and her femininity. Her own sister stood there, intertwining her fingers with the man who had promised Georgia his life. Beatrice offered a small, pathetic look of apology that did not reach her triumphant eyes. Sister, forgive me, Beatrice said, her voice laced with a honeyed sweetness that made Georgia sick to her stomach. We tried to fight it, but the moon goddess willed it. We cannot defy fate. Georgia wanted to scream. She wanted to summon her wolf, to shift and tear the emerald gown from her sister's back. But Abram was right about one thing. Her wolf had always been inexplicably silent. Buried so deep within her psyche, Georgia rarely felt more than a phantom itch beneath her skin. She had no power to challenge an alpha. She had no standing to fight back. She was utterly, entirely alone. Leave the altar, Georgia, Abram commanded. Not with malice, but with the cold, bureaucratic tone of a man dismissing a servant. The ceremony will proceed. With my true mate. Georgia could not move. Her velvet shoes felt fused to the ancient stone. The whispers of the high-born guests merged into a deafening roar in her ears. Defective, jilted, spinster, pathetic. I said, step down, Abram repeated, a dominant alpha command lacing his tone, meant to force her body into submission. Before the command could force her knees to buckle, the massive oak and iron doors at the rear of the cathedral exploded open. The sound was like a cannon blast. The heavy wood slammed against the stone walls with such force that a stained glass pane depicting the moon goddess shattered, raining colorful shards onto the vestibule floor. The howling winter storm outside rushed in, extinguishing the hundreds of candlelight torches lining the aisle in a matter of seconds. The cathedral was plunged into the gloomy gray light of the storm. A terrifying silence fell over the room. Even Abram's dominant aura evaporated, swallowed whole by the suffocating, crushing pressure that rolled into the sanctuary. It was an aura so dense, so terrifyingly powerful, that several weaker wolves in the back pews immediately dropped to their knees, whimpering in involuntary submission. The scent was intoxicating and lethal like ozone right before a lightning strike, mixed with dark cedar and ancient earth. Footsteps echoed against the stone. Slow, methodical, heavy with the weight of absolute authority. From the shadows of the vestibule emerged a figure wrapped in a sweeping cloak of black wolf fur. As he stepped into the dim light, the congregation collectively stopped breathing. It was Valerius Dominic Wells, the Alpha King of the unified Northern Territories, the Sovereign of Shadows. Valerius was a living legend, a warlord who had united the fractured Northern Pacts through sheer, unadulterated power and ruthless cunning. He rarely left his fortress in the Obsidian Peaks, and he certainly did not attend the provincial weddings of his vassals. Yet here he was, standing well over 6.5 feet tall, clad in armor of blackened steel and dark leather that absorbed the meager light. His hair was as dark as a raven's wing, falling just past his shoulders, and his eyes were a piercing, luminescent amber that glowed in the cathedral's gloom. He didn't look like a king attending a celebration. He looked like a god of war demanding a sacrifice. Who dares command a daughter of the ancient lines to step aside like a common stray? Valerius's voice was a low, resonant baritone that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly against the bones. Abram swallowed hard, his previous bravado faltering. He instinctively pushed Beatrice slightly behind him, recognizing the lethal threat of the king's presence. My king, Abram managed, bowing his head in a show of respect. We did not expect you. You honor us with your presence. But this is a pack matter, an internal dispute of mating rights. Valerius began to walk down the center aisle. The crowd parted violently, people practically climbing over the wooden pews to get out of his path. His amber eyes never left the altar. He completely ignored Abram, his gaze locking onto the trembling figure of Georgia, still draped in her white gown and veil. An internal dispute, Valerius repeated softly, the mockery evident in his tone. He reached the front of the aisle, standing between Abram and the altar. The sheer size of the king made Abram look like an untrained pup. I received word that the Alpha of Silverpine was breaking a blood-sworn treaty signed under my royal seal. I came to see if the rumors of your staggering stupidity were true, Kingsley. It appears they were understated. Abram flushed, his pride warring with his survival instincts. My king, the treaty was signed under the assumption of a viable union, but Georgia's wolf is dormant. She is unfit to be a Luna. The goddess has blessed me with her sister instead. I am merely following the divine law of the mate bond. The divine law, Valerius mused. He finally tore his gaze away from Georgia to look at Abram and Beatrice. He sneered, his upper lip curling to reveal the edge of an elongated canine. You speak of divine law while standing in a house of worship, attempting to swap brides like horses at a market. You claim her wolf is dormant. You claim she is unfit. Valerius turned his back on Abram, dismissing him entirely an insult of the highest order among alphas, showing he considered Abram absolutely no threat. He ascended the 3 stone steps to the altar. He stopped directly in front of Georgia. Georgia's breath caught in her throat. Up close, the king was terrifyingly beautiful. A jagged scar ran down the left side of his jaw, a testament to the brutal wars he had fought. The scent of ozone and cedar wrapped around her, and for the first time in her 22 years of life, the phantom itch beneath her skin ignited into a raging inferno. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her vision tunneled. Mate. The word echoed in her mind, not a gentle whisper, but a ferocious roar from the wolf she had thought was dead. The shock of it nearly made her collapse. Valerius reached out with a large, heavily scarred hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he grasped the edge of her sheer veil and slowly lifted it over her head, exposing her pale, tear-streaked face. His amber eyes softened for a fraction of a second, scanning her features as if memorizing a map to a hidden treasure. For 5 years, Valerius said, his voice dropping to a murmur meant only for her, though the silent cathedral heard every word. I allowed you to remain hidden in this pathetic territory because the seers told me the time was not right. I allowed this fool to court you, knowing his weak blood would never awaken your true nature. I waited until the celestial alignment dictated your curse would break. Georgia stared at him, bewildered. My curse? Valerius didn't answer her directly. Instead, he turned to the trembling high priest. He reached out and effortlessly plucked the silver and wolfsbane groom's crown from the priest's hands. The wedding will proceed, Valerius announced to the silent room. He turned the silver circlet in his hands, inspecting it with mild disdain before placing it squarely upon his own dark head. The image was surreal, the terrifying, armor-clad Alpha King wearing the delicate wedding crown of a provincial lord. He turned back to the crowd, his amber eyes locking onto Abram, but the groom has been replaced. Chaos erupted in the cathedral. Whispers turned into shouts, gasps into cries of outrage and confusion. The sheer audacity of the Alpha King claiming a bride at the altar of another man's wedding was unheard of in the history of Ethelgard. "You cannot do this," Abram shouted, his anger finally overriding his fear of the king. He stepped toward the altar, his eyes flashing yellow as his wolf pushed to the surface. "She is of my pack. You have no legal claim to her, king or not." Valerius turned slowly, his cloak swirling around his armored boots. The look he gave Abram was one of absolute freezing disdain. "Legal claim?" The king laughed, a dark, terrifying sound that held no humor. "You rejected her. You severed all pack ties and legal claims the moment you renounced your vows before the goddess and this congregation. She belongs to no man. And as sovereign, all unclaimed lands, assets, and individuals fall under the protection of the crown." "She is an Alcott," Beatrice shrilled, her facade of the gentle, apologetic sister vanishing. "She is a defective wolf. Why would the king want the cast-offs of the Silverpine pack?" Valerius's gaze snapped to Beatrice. The sheer pressure of his anger forced Beatrice to her knees, her hands flying to her throat as if she were suffocating. Speak of your betters with respect, little snake, Valerius commanded, his voice dark and deadly. Or I will tear your tongue from your mouth and feed it to the ravens. He turned back to the crowd, raising his voice so it echoed against the high vaulted ceilings. You call her defective. You call her dormant. Fools, all of you. You are blind to what stands before you. Valerius reached out and gently took Georgia's hand. His skin was burning hot against her freezing fingers. Georgia's wolf is not dormant. It was bound. Bound by a blood curse placed upon her by her own mother, who feared the power of a true Royal Omega. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Royal Omegas were myths, legends from the old world. They were wolves of immense spiritual power, capable of calming raging alphas, healing catastrophic wounds, and bearing heirs of unfathomable strength. They were the most prized, revered mates in werewolf history, hunted to near extinction centuries ago. A Royal Omega emits a scent so powerful it drives unmated alphas to madness, Valerius explained, his amber eyes scanning the crowd. Her mother placed a binding seal on her core to hide her, to make her appear scentless and weak, so she would survive. But the seal was tied to her innocence and her emotional stability. The trauma of absolute betrayal. Valerius smiled grimly at Abram. It was exactly what was needed to shatter the binding. As if on cue, the burning sensation within Georgia erupted. She gasped, arching her back as a sudden blinding heat flared in her chest. The invisible chains that had kept her spirit restrained for 22 years snapped. Instantly, a scent flooded the cathedral. It was not the simple, pleasant smell of pine or berries. It was the scent of night-blooming jasmine, rain-soaked earth, and raw, untamed power. It was intoxicating. It was heavy. Around the room, several unmated male wolves groaned, their eyes flashing glowing colors as their inner beasts reacted violently to the overwhelming pheromones of a Royal Omega entering her awakening. Abram staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and sudden, desperate greed. He inhaled deeply, his wolf recognizing the catastrophic mistake he had just made. The dull, scentless woman he had discarded was suddenly radiating an aura that rivaled the king's. Georgia. Abram breathed, taking a step toward her, entirely forgetting the woman kneeling beside him in the green dress. Georgia. Wait. I didn't know. The rejection. We can undo it. The priest hasn't finalized. Valerius moved so fast he was nothing but a blur of black and steel. In less than a second, he was off the altar and standing chest to chest with Abram. The king's hand shot out, wrapping around Abram's throat. He lifted the silver pine alpha off his feet with one arm, suspending him in the air. Abram choked, his legs kicking wildly as Valerius's grip tightened like an iron vice. If you ever speak her name again, Valerius whispered, the sound carrying easily in the dead silence of the terrified church, I will rip your head from your shoulders and mount it on the gates of my fortress. You threw away a diamond to pick up a shiny rock, Kingsley. Now, you will live with your choice. Valerius tossed Abram aside like a broken doll. The alpha crashed into the heavy wooden pews, splintering the ancient oak. Beatrice screamed, scrambling over to him, her beautiful emerald dress tearing on the wood. Valerius did not spare them another glance. He walked back up the steps to Georgia. She was trembling violently, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of her wolf's senses. Colors were brighter, the scents of the room were deafening, and the bond pulling her to the giant man before her was a physical ache in her chest. Breathe, little wolf, Valerius murmured, his voice softening entirely. He unclasped the heavy black wolf fur cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around Georgia's shivering frame. It smelled intensely of him of safety, power, and home. The awakening is harsh, but you are not alone anymore. I have you. Why did you come for me? Georgia whispered, clutching the edges of his cloak, her mind spinning as she stared up into his luminescent eyes. Because you were always mine, Valerius replied simply. He looked out at the high priest, who was cowering behind the altar. Complete the binding rite. Now. The priest fumbled with his ceremonial dagger and the silver chalice. But, my king, the banns have not been read. The preparations. I am the king of the north. My word is law. Read the rites, or I will find a priest who can, Valerius growled. Trembling, the priest began the ancient chants of the moon goddess. Valerius took Georgia's hands in his. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely seen. The man before her did not look at her with pity or obligation. He looked at her with a fierce, possessive reverence that made her newly awakened wolf purr in deep, resonant contentment. As the final words of the blessing were spoken, Valerius leaned down. His lips brushed hers, a promise sealed in front of the very people who had gathered to watch her downfall. The mating bond snapped into place, a brilliant, blinding tether of light in her mind. "Come, my queen," Valerius said, turning away from the altar and keeping Georgia securely tucked under his arm. They walked back down the aisle, the Alpha King still wearing the silver groom's crown. The congregation bowed their heads, parting in absolute submission. Georgia did not look back at Abram, who was clutching his bruised throat, staring in horrified realization at the throne he had just lost. She did not look at her sister's pale, jealous face. She walked out of the shattered doors of the cathedral and into the storm, stepping out of the shadow of betrayal and into the arms of the king. The obsidian peaks were not merely a fortress. They were a monument to the unyielding power of the north. Hewn from the dark, volcanic rock of the surrounding mountains, the royal citadel loomed over the valleys like a sleeping dragon. For Georgia Margaret Alcott, this imposing structure had become something she never anticipated: a sanctuary. In the 6 months following the disastrous wedding at St. Jude's Cathedral, Georgia underwent a metamorphosis that left the entire kingdom in awe. The breaking of her mother's binding curse had not just awakened her wolf, it had unleashed a tidal wave of dormant energy. As a royal Omega, Georgia possessed abilities that had been relegated to history books and fireside myths. Her mere presence in the great halls of the citadel brought a palpable sense of peace to the often volatile royal guard. Her scent, that intoxicating blend of night-blooming jasmine and rain-soaked earth, soothed the aggressive instincts of Valerius's most battle-hardened warriors, allowing the king's armies to train and operate with unprecedented unity. More importantly, the bond between Georgia and Valerius Dominic Wells blossomed into a formidable partnership. Valerius was not the tyrant the provincial lords whispered about in the dark. Behind the closed doors of their private chambers, the Sovereign of Shadows was fiercely devoted, incredibly patient, and entirely captivated by his mate. He did not treat her as a fragile prize to be protected, but as an equal whose intuition and emotional intelligence perfectly balanced his militaristic ruthlessness. Meanwhile, life in the Silverpine territory had descended into absolute chaos. Abram William Kingsley quickly learned that a mate bond based on lust and superficial dominance could not sustain a pack. Beatrice Rose Alcott was beautiful and fierce, but she lacked the discipline, the empathy, and the political acumen required of a true Luna. When the brutal northern winter set in, the consequences of Abram's broken vows materialized with devastating clarity. The trade treaties between the Alcott family and the Kingsley pack had been instantly nullified the moment Abram humiliated Georgia. Without the crucial grain shipments and medicinal herbs from the Alcott estates, Silverpine storehouses ran dangerously low. Adding to their ruin, neighboring packs, sensing Abram's weakness and eager to curry favor with the Alpha King, began heavily taxing Silverpine's borders. Abram's people were starving, his warriors were defecting, and the whispers of rebellion grew louder with every passing blizzard. Desperation breeds audacity. Which was why, on the coldest morning of the solstice, the heavy iron gates of the Obsidian Peaks groaned open to admit 2 unexpected and highly unwelcome guests. Georgia was seated in the sunlit solar, reviewing agricultural reports with Lord Henry Beaufort, the king's master of coin, when the heavy oak doors swung open. Valerius entered, his armor dusted with fresh snow, his jaw tight. The lethal stillness of his posture communicated instantly that something was wrong. "My king?" Georgia asked, setting her parchment aside. "We have beggars at the gates, my queen," Valerius replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He crossed the room, pulling her up by the waist and pressing a kiss to her temple to soothe his own agitated wolf. "Abram Kingsley and your sister have requested an audience. They seek royal aid for Silverpine." Georgia stiffened, the phantom memory of her humiliation flashing behind her eyes. But then, she felt the steady, thrumming power of her Omega core. She was no longer the trembling, defective bride standing at the altar. She was the Queen of the North. "Bring them to the Great Hall," Georgia commanded softly, her voice steady. "It is time we settled the debts of the past." Valerius's lips curved into a proud, dangerous smile. "As you wish, little wolf." An hour later, Georgia sat upon the intricately carved throne of weirwood and iron, positioned directly beside Valerius's massive obsidian seat. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, a silver diadem resting gracefully upon her braided hair. When the heavy doors of the great hall were pushed open by the royal guards, Abram and Beatrice were escorted inside. The sight of them was a stark contrast to their triumphant display at the cathedral 6 months prior. Abram looked gaunt, the dark circles under his eyes betraying countless sleepless nights. His posture, once brimming with alpha arrogance, was defensively hunched. Beside him, Beatrice wore a heavy traveling cloak over a dress that had seen better days. The chaotic, vibrant energy she once exuded was entirely gone, replaced by an anxious, resentful exhaustion. They halted at the base of the dais. The room was utterly silent, save for the crackling of the massive hearth fires. "My king, my queen," Abram began, his voice raspy. He forced himself to drop to one knee, pulling a reluctant Beatrice down with him. The submission was painful for him, a bitter pill he had to swallow. "We come before the crown to beg for clemency and aid. The winter has been unusually cruel. The Silverpine pack is starving." Georgia looked down at the man who had publicly discarded her. She felt no anger, only a profound, hollow pity. Before Georgia could speak, Beatrice's head snapped up. Her emerald eyes, though tired, sparked with a desperate, manipulative fire. "Georgia, please," she pleaded, abandoning all royal protocol. She put on the exact mask of innocent desperation she had used to manipulate their parents for years. "We are family. You cannot sit up there in your velvet and jewels while your own sister freezes in the valleys. We made a mistake, yes, but surely you have it in your heart to forgive us. For the sake of the blood we share?" A low growl vibrated from Valerius's chest, rattling the very stones of the hall. The royal guards stepped forward, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. Valerius would not tolerate such disrespect toward his mate. Georgia placed a calming hand on Valerius's arm. The king instantly silenced his growl, though his amber eyes remained locked on Beatrice like a predator eyeing its prey. Georgia stood up. She slowly descended the steps of the dais, the train of her blue gown gliding silently over the stone floor. As she approached them, she let her royal omega aura expand. It was not a crushing, suffocating weight like a king's dominance. Instead, it was an overwhelming wave of absolute, unshakable authority. It flooded the room, forcing both Abram and Beatrice to lower their eyes, their wolves instinctively submitting to the pure, ancient power radiating from her. "Family," Georgia repeated, the word tasting like ash. "You speak of family, Beatrice? Where was your familial loyalty when you stood in St. Jude's Cathedral, wearing emerald green, and plotted to strip me of my dignity, my future, and my pack?" "We couldn't help the mate bond," Beatrice cried, her voice cracking under the pressure of Georgia's aura. "You engineered it," Georgia corrected sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Do not mistake my previous silence for stupidity. I know you flooded Abram's chambers with your pheromones for weeks leading up to the wedding. I know you orchestrated the rejection. You wanted a crown, Beatrice. You wanted the prestige of being a Luna." Georgia gestured gracefully toward Abram's kneeling, defeated form. "Well, you have it. You stole a hollow crown, and now you are crumbling beneath its weight." Abram looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic longing as he stared at Georgia. He finally saw her, truly saw her, not as the quiet, dutiful girl he had dismissed, but as the radiant, powerful woman who could have saved his entire lineage. The intoxicating scent of her omega nature hit him like a physical blow, a cruel reminder of what he had thrown away. "Georgia, I was a fool," Abram rasped, his voice trembling. "I was blinded by lust and pride. My wolf howls for you every night. The goddess was punishing me by blinding me to your true nature. If you return to Silverpine, if you claim your rightful place, the pack will thrive again. We can annul." The air in the great hall literally snapped. Before Abram could finish his treasonous sentence, Valerius was on his feet. The king did not walk. He seemed to materialize at the base of the dais. The sheer, apocalyptic fury rolling off Valerius was so intense that the stained glass windows of the hall rattled in their frames. The king's eyes were completely luminescent, glowing with the terrifying, untamed rage of his inner beast. "You dare," Valerius whispered, his voice a lethal hiss that echoed through the cavernous room. "You dare come into my home, stand before my throne, and proposition my mate? Abram fell backward onto the stone, scrambling away as the king loomed over him. "My king, please, mercy. I only meant—" "You meant to insult the crown," Valerius roared, the sound deafening. "You meant to treat the royal queen as a bargaining chip for your failing, pathetic territory." Valerius reached for the massive broadsword strapped to his back, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. Beatrice screamed, burying her face in her hands. "Valerius, wait." Georgia's voice was soft, yet it cut through the king's blinding rage like a knife through silk. Valerius froze, the blade hovering inches from Abram's neck. He turned his glowing eyes to his mate, his chest heaving. Georgia stepped forward, placing her delicate hand over Valerius's scarred, massive one that gripped the hilt of the sword. Her touch was a balm, her omega energy wrapping around his furious alpha spirit, coaxing the beast back from the edge of execution. "He is not worth the stain on your blade, my love," Georgia said calmly, holding Valerius's gaze until the violent, luminescent glow in his eyes faded back to a warm, recognizable amber. Valerius let out a long, shuddering breath, slowly lowering the sword. He stepped back, conceding the floor entirely to her. Georgia turned back to the trembling pair on the floor. Her expression was devoid of anger, replaced by the cold, impartial justice of a sovereign. "Abram Kingsley." "Beatrice Alcott," Georgia announced, her voice projecting clearly to every corner of the hall, ensuring the royal scribes recorded every word. "You came seeking the protection of the crown. But a king and queen only protect those who honor the laws of the realm. By breaking your blood-sworn vows before the moon goddess, you severed Silverpine's right to royal subsidies. By disrespecting the queen in her own hall, you have proven yourselves unfit to govern." Abram's face drained of all color. "No, please." Effective immediately, the territory of Silverpine is stripped of its autonomous alpha status, Georgia declared, delivering the final, crushing blow. "Your lands will be placed under the direct governance of the crown. Abram, you are stripped of your alpha title. You and Beatrice will be permitted to live on the outskirts of the territory, working the land as common members of the pack. If you attempt to incite a rebellion, you will be exiled to the frozen wastes." Beatrice collapsed onto the stone floor, sobbing hysterically. The grand, luxurious life she had schemed and betrayed her own sister to attain had completely evaporated, leaving her with a lifetime of hard labor and public disgrace. Abram remained frozen, staring blankly at the floor as the weight of his monumental failure crushed the last remnants of his pride. "Guards," Valerius commanded, stepping up beside his queen. "Escort them out. Ensure they are placed on the first wagon back to their new farm." The royal guards hauled Abram and Beatrice to their feet, dragging the weeping, broken couple out of the great hall. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate. The silence that followed was peaceful. The heavy, toxic energy they had brought into the room dissipated, leaving only the warmth of the hearth and the quiet strength of the ruling monarchs. Valerius turned to Georgia, sheathing his sword. He reached out, gently cupping her face in his large, calloused hands. The ferocious warlord was entirely gone, replaced by a man looking at the center of his universe. "You are magnificent," Valerius murmured, tracing the line of her cheekbone with his thumb. "A true queen." Sparing his life was a harsher punishment than taking it. Georgia smiled, leaning into his touch. The phantom itch beneath her skin was gone forever, replaced by the steady, powerful heartbeat of her awakened wolf. "I didn't do it to punish him, Valerius. I did it because I am no longer tied to the past. They are nothing to me now. My future, my life, my pack is here. With you." Valerius's amber eyes burned with profound devotion. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of victory, of destiny, and of an unbreakable bond. In the end, Abram Kingsley had believed he was throwing away a defective, worthless bride. He never realized that by leaving her at the altar, he had not only handed the realm its most powerful queen, but he had given the lethal Alpha King the only thing he had ever truly wanted. Georgia had lost a weak lord, but she had gained an empire, a true mate, and a crown that nobody would ever take from her again. Did you love this tale of betrayal, revenge, and destined mates? If Georgia's journey from a discarded bride to a powerful alpha queen kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this story with your friends who love a fierce romantic drama with a satisfying twist. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our thrilling werewolf romances and epic audio stories. See you next time.